The gentle sway of the morning subway car had always been Sarah's time to catch up on her audiobooks, but today something felt different. Maybe it was the way the autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the crowded train, or perhaps it was the unusually heavy weight of exhaustion from her night shift at the hospital. As a first-year nurse, she had grown accustomed to the bone-deep tiredness, but this morning's commute home felt particularly challenging. Through her peripheral vision, she noticed an elderly gentleman step onto the train, his weathered hands gripping a worn wooden cane. The subway lurched forward, causing him to stumble slightly. Sarah noticed how his knuckles whitened as he gripped the overhead rail, trying to maintain his balance while other passengers seemed lost in their phones, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Without hesitation, Sarah pulled out her earbuds and stood up. "Sir, please take my seat," she said, gesturing to the spot she had just vacated. The old man's eyes met hers, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it surprise, gratitude, or something else entirely? As he slowly lowered himself into the seat, she noticed his hands trembling slightly. His well-worn but carefully maintained coat spoke of someone who took pride in their appearance despite limited means. What caught her attention most, though, was the small, tattered photograph peeking out of his breast pocket. "Thank you, dear," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to cut through the usual morning commute indifference. "You know, it's been years since someone—" He paused, his eyes growing distant as if lost in a memory. "Would you mind if I shared something with you?" The train clattered through the tunnel, but Sarah found herself drawn into the moment. Other passengers continued their routine, scrolling through phones, sipping coffee, checking watches, but between her and this stranger, time seemed to slow down. "Of course," Sarah replied, steadying herself against the pole as the train rounded a bend. What happened next would become one of those rare moments that remind us how a simple act of kindness can unfold into something extraordinary. The elderly man reached for that mysterious photograph in his pocket, his fingers handling it with the gentleness one might reserve for the most precious of treasures. His eyes welled up with tears, but a smile played at the corners of his mouth. 63 years ago, on a train much like this one, someone offered their seat to a young man who had just returned from war. That small gesture led to— The screech of brakes cut through his words as the train pulled into the next station. A flood of passengers rushed in, pushing Sarah a few steps away from him. She tried to make her way back, desperate to hear the rest of his story, but the crowd kept growing. Through the sea of bodies, she caught his eye one last time. He held up the photograph, trying to show her something. Just then, the train lurched forward again. Sarah stumbled, temporarily losing sight of him. When she regained her balance and looked back, her heart skipped a beat. The seat was empty. But there, on the worn fabric of the subway seat, lay something that would reveal a connection she never could have imagined. A connection that would not only change her understanding of that morning's simple gesture, but would also reshape her entire perspective on the ripple effects of kindness through time. Little did Sarah know, this was just the beginning of a story that would touch not only her life, but the lives of countless others who would come to hear it. Sarah's hand trembled as she picked up what the elderly man had left behind. A black and white photograph, its edges worn soft from decades of handling. The image showed a young couple standing in front of a train station, their faces bright with the kind of hope that only youth can bring. The woman wore a nurse's uniform, remarkably similar to the one Sarah wore now, while the young man stood proudly in a military dress uniform. The crowd had thinned enough for her to sit in the now vacant seat. As she settled in, something about the photograph made her pulse quicken. The station in the background looked familiar. It was the same one she passed through every day, though the architecture in the image spoke of a different era. She turned the photograph over, finding faded handwriting that read, "To my dearest Elizabeth, thank you for that seat on the train. You changed everything. Forever yours, Thomas." 1961. Sarah's mind raced back to her grandmother's stories. Could it be? Her grandmother Elizabeth had also been a nurse, working the night shift at the same hospital where Sarah now worked. She'd often told Sarah about meeting her grandfather on a train after a long shift, but the details had always seemed like the kind of romantic storytelling grandmothers loved to share. Pulling out her phone, Sarah's fingers flew across the screen, pulling up an old family photo album she digitized last year. There it was, the same photograph, pristinely preserved in her grandmother's collection. Her heart nearly stopped. The elderly man on the train had been her grandfather, Thomas, but how? He had passed away 5 years ago. The subway car suddenly felt too warm, too small. Sarah loosened her scrub top's collar, trying to catch her breath. Fellow passengers must have noticed her distress because a young man nearby asked if she was okay. She nodded, unable to find words to explain what was happening. Her grandmother Elizabeth was in the hospital now, recovering from a fall. Sarah had been pulling extra shifts to help pay for her care, which explained her exhaustion this morning. But what explained everything else? The photograph in her hands was real, worn, and aged in a way that couldn't be faked. As the train approached her stop, Sarah noticed something else falling from the seat, a small envelope yellowed with age. Inside was a letter, the handwriting matching that on the back of the photograph. The date at the top read, October 27, 2024, today's date. Sarah's hands shook as she began to read. To my dear granddaughter, I've been watching you follow in Elizabeth's footsteps, caring for others even when you're exhausted. You have her heart, her spirit. That day in 1961, when she offered me her seat, I was returning from war, wounded in both body and spirit. Her simple act of kindness gave me hope when I needed it most. But there's something you don't know about that day, something I never told anyone, not even Elizabeth. The train's automated announcement cut through her reading. Next stop, Central Station. Sarah looked up, realizing she needed to get off for her transfer. As she stood, clutching the letter and photograph, a sudden gust of wind from an opening door ruffled the pages. She glimpsed words further down the letter that made her freeze. The secret I've carried all these years involves a promise I made, a promise that affects our entire family, and today is the day you need to know the truth. Sarah stepped onto the platform, her mind swirling with questions. Why today? Why did her grandfather choose this moment to reveal a secret he kept for over 60 years? And most importantly, what could be so significant that he needed to reach across time itself to share it? The hospital corridors felt longer than usual as Sarah made her way to her grandmother's room, the letter and photograph secure in her scrub pocket. Her footsteps echoed against the polished floors, each step bringing her closer to what she hoped would be answers. Through the window of room 415, she could see Elizabeth sitting up in bed, silver hair neatly braided, working on a crossword puzzle just as she did every morning. "Grandma," Sarah said softly, entering the room. The morning sun cast a warm glow across the hospital bed, highlighting the familiar creases of her grandmother's smile. For a moment, Sarah saw the young nurse from the photograph, that same determined glint in her eyes that had never faded with age. Elizabeth looked up, her crossword forgotten as she noticed Sarah's expression. "You've seen him, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The puzzle book slipped from her lap, scattering onto the floor. Sarah rushed forward to pick it up, but stopped when she saw what had fallen with it. Another photograph, identical to the one in her pocket, but this one looked brand new. Sarah pulled out her weathered copy, placing them side by side on the hospital bed. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she touched both photographs. "Every year on this day he finds a way to remind me," she said, tears gathering in her eyes. "Your grandfather was more than just a soldier I met on a train. That day changed everything, but not in the way everyone thinks." Reaching into her bedside drawer, Elizabeth pulled out a small diary, its pages yellow with age. "The secret your grandfather carried," she began, but her voice cracked. "It wasn't just his to keep. We both made a promise that day, a promise to protect something precious, something that would affect generations to come." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her grandmother's words sending chills down her spine. The diary's pages contained detailed entries, all dated from 1961. As Elizabeth opened it, a small key fell into her lap, old and brass, unlike any key Sarah had seen before. Your grandfather wasn't just returning from war that day, Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger. He was carrying something, something that could have changed the course of history. When I offered him my seat, I wasn't just being kind. I was fulfilling a duty I didn't even know I had. A knock at the door made them both jump. A nurse entered, carrying Elizabeth's morning medication. Sarah noticed her grandmother quickly sliding the diary under her blanket, her eyes conveying a silent message. Not yet. The nurse smiled, checked Elizabeth's vitals, and left, but those few minutes of interruption felt like hours. As soon as they were alone again, Elizabeth gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "We have to go somewhere," she said, trying to push herself up from the bed. "Today's the day. After all these years, it's finally time." She pointed to her closet, where her clothes hung neatly pressed. "Help me get dressed. There's something you need to see." "But Grandma, you're not discharged yet. You can't just leave," Sarah protested, though she was already moving toward the closet, drawn by the urgency in her grandmother's voice. "Some things are more important than hospital protocols," Elizabeth said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used during her own nursing days. "Your grandfather knew you would be the one, Sarah. He knew you would follow in my footsteps, not just as a nurse, but as a guardian." As Sarah helped her grandmother dress, the word guardian echoed in her mind. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the hospital windows, and dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. Whatever secret her grandparents had kept for over 6 decades, whatever promise they had made, Sarah realized this was the moment everything would change, just as it had that day in 1961 when a simple act of kindness on a train had set this all in motion. The elevator ride to the hospital basement felt eternal, each floor passing with a heavy clang that matched Sarah's heartbeat. Elizabeth stood beside her, one hand gripping her IV pole for support, the other clutching the brass key. The diary was tucked safely in Sarah's pocket, its presence somehow heavier than it should be. "Your grandfather wasn't just any soldier," Elizabeth whispered as they descended. "He was part of a special unit, tasked with protecting something that many would kill to possess. That day on the train, he wasn't just looking for a seat. He was looking for someone he could trust." The elevator shuddered to a stop at B3, a floor Sarah hadn't known existed despite working at the hospital for over a year. As the doors opened, they were met not with the expected storage area or maintenance room, but with a long, dimly lit corridor lined with photographs. Sarah gasped as she realized each image showed a different nurse offering their seat to a stranger, hundreds of them spanning decades. At the end of each photo was a date and 2 names. "We're part of a legacy," Elizabeth explained, her steps becoming more confident despite her recent fall. "A network of guardians, passing down our duty from generation to generation. Every kind gesture isn't just kindness. It's a test, a way of finding those with the right heart to carry on our work." They reached the end of the corridor, where a heavy wooden door stood unmarked except for a small brass keyhole. Elizabeth raised the key, but her hand froze mid-motion. "Listen carefully, Sarah. Once we open this door, there's no going back. Your life will change forever, just as mine did." Before Sarah could respond, footsteps echoed behind them. They turned to see a young man in scrubs, someone Sarah recognized from the emergency department. "I was wondering when you'd bring her down here, Mrs. Walker," he said, his friendly smile not quite reaching his eyes. "But I'm afraid I can't let you open that door." Elizabeth's grip on Sarah's arm tightened. "Richard," she said, her voice cold, "how long have they had you watching us?" "Long enough," he replied, taking a step forward. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice? That we wouldn't be ready when the time came?" He reached into his pocket, pulling out an identical brass key. Thomas wasn't the only one with secrets that day on the train. There were others, watching, waiting. "We've been patient for 63 years. Sarah moved protectively in front of her grandmother, her mind racing. The young man she'd passed in the halls countless times now seemed like a stranger, his familiar scrubs feeling like a costume. Through the fabric of her pocket, she could feel the diary pressing against her leg, and suddenly she remembered something. The last words she glimpsed in her grandfather's letter. Trust no one who doesn't know the words. Sarah, Elizabeth whispered, so softly she almost missed it. Do you remember the lullaby I used to sing to you? The one about the train and the stranger? Before Sarah could respond, the lights in the corridor began to flicker, casting strange shadows on the hundreds of photographs. In that moment of darkness, Sarah saw something in Richard's other hand glinting metallically, and she realized with growing horror that this was more than just a family secret. It was a decades-old conflict coming to its breaking point, and she was standing at its center. Through the emergency lights, the faces in the photographs seemed to watch them, generations of guardians bearing witness to this moment. Whatever lay behind that door had been worth protecting for over 60 years, and now its fate rested in Sarah's hands. But as Richard took another step forward, she realized the real question wasn't what was behind the door. It was who she could trust to help her protect it. Sarah's voice trembled as she began singing softly, the words of her grandmother's lullaby echoing through the corridor. On a morning train so bright, a stranger shared their light. Richard's confident smirk faltered, his hand tightening around whatever he was holding. To everyone's surprise, another voice joined in from the shadows behind him, clear, strong, and familiar. When kindness meets its match, a guardian takes their watch. Dr. Chen, the hospital's chief of medicine, stepped into view, her white coat swishing against the floor. Richard spun around, but before he could react, 2 security guards emerged from the other end of the corridor. Richard Thompson, Dr. Chen announced, or should I say, Agent Thompson. Your cover was impressive, but we've been watching you too. Elizabeth let out a relieved laugh. I was wondering when you'd show up, Marie. Just like your mother, always making an entrance. Sarah looked between her grandmother and Dr. Chen in confusion, understanding slowly dawning. The photograph of the young nurse offering her seat, the one next to her grandparents' picture, suddenly made sense. It showed a young woman with Dr. Chen's same determined expression. As the security guards led a struggling Richard away, Dr. Chen explained, Our families have been working together for generations, Sarah. Your grandfather and my mother were part of the original group of guardians. What's behind that door isn't just a secret. It's hope, preserved through countless acts of kindness, waiting for the right moment. Elizabeth stepped forward, her hand steady as she finally inserted the brass key into the lock. The door swung open to reveal not a vault or a treasure room, but a small garden, somehow thriving despite being underground. In the center stood a single tree, its leaves shimmering with an otherworldly light. Beneath it sat a simple wooden bench, identical to the ones found in train stations decades ago. During the war, Elizabeth explained, your grandfather's unit discovered something extraordinary, a seed that could grow even in the darkest places, bringing life and healing wherever it took root. But in the wrong hands, it could be weaponized, turned into something destructive. The government wanted to study it, exploit it. So a group of soldiers made a different choice. They chose to protect it, Dr. Chen continued, hiding it in plain sight, in a place where acts of kindness would keep it strong. Every time someone offers their seat to a stranger, every small gesture of compassion, it feeds the tree's power. The real secret wasn't the tree itself. It was discovering that human kindness could be its greatest protector. Sarah approached the bench, noticing a fresh engraving, to my granddaughter, who proved that kindness still grows in the hardest times. Love, Thomas. As she traced the words with her fingers, a leaf from the tree floated down, landing in her lap. Where it touched her scrubs, the fabric began to glow faintly, spreading warmth through her tired muscles. That's why he appeared to you today, Elizabeth said softly. The tree chooses its guardians, showing itself to those who prove their hearts are ready. Your simple act of kindness on the train wasn't just you following in my footsteps. It was you showing that you were ready to carry on our work. But as they stood in the peaceful garden, Sarah noticed something her grandmother and Dr. Chen had missed. A small screen hidden among the tree's roots, displaying a countdown. There were numbers ticking away, and next to them, words that made her heart skip. Transfer protocol initiated. New location required. The tree's light pulsed once, and Sarah realized their work wasn't finished. It was just beginning. In her pocket, Her grandfather's letter suddenly felt warm. There was one last page she hadn't read, and somehow she knew it would explain exactly what needed to happen next. The real question was, who would help her do it? Sarah pulled out the final page of her grandfather's letter, its edges glowing faintly in the tree's light. Her grandmother and Dr. Chen gathered close as she read aloud. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then you've already discovered that kindness is more than just a choice. It's a force that can change the world. The tree must be moved every 63 years, taken to a place where compassion still thrives naturally. You'll know where. Trust your heart, just as I trusted mine that day on the train. The countdown display showed just under 48 hours remaining. Dr. Chen touched one of the tree's branches gently, causing a cascade of shimmering leaves. The original guardians chose this hospital because it was a place where kindness happened naturally, where people dedicated their lives to helping others. But times change, and so must we. Elizabeth smiled, her eyes bright with understanding. Sarah, think about where you see the most genuine acts of kindness in your daily life. As the words left her grandmother's mouth, Sarah knew exactly where the tree needed to go. Every morning on her commute, she witnessed small gestures of compassion. Teenagers helping elderly passengers with heavy bags, strangers sharing umbrellas during unexpected rain, children offering their snacks to hungry people. The subway station, Sarah whispered, not just any platform, the one where this all began, where you and Grandpa met. It's always been a place where people from all walks of life come together, where small acts of kindness happen every day without anyone asking for them. Over the next 48 hours, a carefully orchestrated plan came together. Dr. Chen revealed a network of guardian families, each playing their part. The tree was carefully transplanted through a forgotten tunnel system connecting the hospital to the old subway network. Sarah's fellow nurses covered her shifts without question, somehow knowing they were contributing to something bigger than themselves. As the last minutes of the countdown ticked away, Sarah stood in a hidden chamber beneath the subway platform where her grandparents' story began. The tree's soft glow merged with the rhythm of trains passing overhead, its roots already reaching into its new home. Elizabeth sat on the bench beneath it, looking more energized than she had in years. Your grandfather appeared to you on that train for a reason, Elizabeth said, patting the spot next to her. He knew you'd understand that true strength isn't in keeping secrets. It's in sharing kindness, even when the world seems dark. That's what really powers this tree, and that's what will keep it safe for the next 63 years. Dr. Chen approached with a small wooden box. Inside was a new brass key and a blank diary. Every guardian adds their own chapter, she explained, handing them to Sarah. But more importantly, they inspire others to show kindness in their own way. That's how the protection really works, not through locks and secrets, but through the ripple effect of compassion. Sarah took the key and diary, understanding now why her grandfather had chosen this moment to reveal everything. In a world that often seemed increasingly divided, the tree stood as a testament to humanity's capacity for connection and kindness. Its light would continue to shine, nourished by countless small acts of compassion happening just above. As she wrote the first entry in her new diary, Sarah smiled, knowing that somewhere on the platform overhead, someone was offering their seat to a stranger, continuing the cycle that had begun so many years ago. The tree's leaves shimmered in response, as if agreeing that sometimes the smallest gestures could create the most powerful magic of all. In the distance, a train's whistle echoed through the tunnel, carrying with it the promise of countless stories yet to unfold, each one beginning with a simple choice to be kind.